When you hear the word Easter, what comes to mind? Well, for a lot of us living in Canada, we think of Easter eggs, Easter bunnies, we think of chocolate, we think of painting eggs and various crafts that children do, and sometimes the adults join in. We think of spring flowers, blossoms on the trees, the renewal of life after a long, cold winter. So spring is a welcome relief after the deadness of winter, when everything's covered in snow and frozen. I think that people in the tropics, in the southern climates, probably would have difficulty understanding just how important Easter is to those of us who have to go through a Canadian winter. But Easter is, of course, more than that for Christians. And I wonder sometimes if perhaps we're not dealing with two different festivals. On the one hand, there's the festival of new life, coming from the earth after a long, cold winter. On the other hand, there's the acknowledgement, the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus. And we've mashed the two together, so much so that sometimes we can't tell the difference. So the story of the resurrection of Jesus, then, is no longer distinct from the celebration of new life in the spring. A lot of people would argue that it is all one and the same, but I think that by mixing the two, we often lose sight of what Easter really does mean, at least for us Christians. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. What does Easter really mean? Well, as I said, here in Canada, Easter is, for most Canadians, a spring festival. It's an opportunity to let down your hair, relax a little bit, enjoy the good weather, and to watch the new life emerging after a long, cold winter. But spring festivals have been observed by human beings ever since history began, in fact, probably before that. If you look around the world, you'll find all kinds of festivals that are very similar to Easter. For instance, in Bangladesh and Western India, there's something called Pahela Baishakh. Excuse my pronunciation. This is the first day of the Bengali calendar, and it's associated with the spring harvest. And then there's Buddha's birthday, which you've probably heard of. Many of the people in our community who come from mainland China are Buddhist, and they celebrate Buddha's birthday with the hanging of lanterns, enjoying community meals with family and friends, parades, visits to temples and offerings, and this usually falls in April and May of each year. In Japan, there's Hanami, which is also known by us as the Cherry Blossom Festival. And we sort of have a Hanami here in Toronto at High Park every year when people come crowding into the park to see the cherry blossoms on the trees. It really is a beautiful sight. For the period of time that the trees are blossoming, they ban traffic in the park. You can't drive in because there's no room with so many people coming to see the beautiful cherry blossoms. And for many, this is the welcoming of spring. Then there's Holi, which is known in India as the Festival of Colors. It represents the arrival of spring, the spring harvest, and the triumph of good over evil. Interesting, that kind of connects with the Christian concept of Easter, where we are celebrating the triumph of the good of God working in our world through Jesus, triumphing over evil and death. In Central Asia and the Middle East, there's Nowruz, which in Persian means new day. It marks the first day of spring. It's celebrated on the vernal equinox, March the 21st, and it's been celebrated for more than 3,000 years. 300 million people globally, it's estimated, celebrate Nowruz. It's strange how so many people on this planet can have an observation, a celebration like this, and many of us not even aware of it, not even aware of the word Nowruz. In Egypt, there's Sham el-Nassim, which is a national holiday, and it marks the beginning of spring. It's celebrated by both Christians and Muslims and falls on the Monday after Easter. And then the final one I'll mention is in Thailand, the Songkran, which celebrates the Buddhist New Year, the beginning of spring, with a massive water-throwing festival. And what people do is they take cold water in buckets and they pour it on each other. And this is a celebration, a welcoming of the spring. So you can see that the idea of Easter as being the time of new life springing forth, death being overcome by life, by Christians, is something which is observed in other ways by people all around the world, various religions and various cultures. We're not unique that way. And once again, that's why I think that we need to take that celebration, which I think is wonderful. I think it's a joyful time of year we should never want to lose. And certainly the church can participate in it, but we need to separate it from the resurrection of Jesus. Yes, there are similarities. He was dead and now he is alive. But and good has overcome evil. But I think that by mixing it in with the spring festival, that what we're doing is we're losing the meaning of the resurrection altogether. Many Anglicans who come to church on Easter Sunday, they're really coming for a spring festival. Just the lovely flowers at the front, the Easter lilies, the decorations and the uplifting hymns. That's what they talk about when they talk about why Easter is important to them. They bring their children, little girls, wearing their Easter dresses, and it used to be that there were Easter bonnets. That was a big thing. The boys dress up specially as well. And that's a wonderful thing. But it, again, is so merged with the Easter message that we lose sight of what the empty tomb represents. Now, there's been a lot of theorizing over the years about the empty tomb. You know, what is it? What does that signify for us today? Okay, so Jesus was raised from the dead, but what does that mean that he was raised from the dead? Some theologians emphasize the fact that this was the time when Christians were galvanized and were sent out on their mission to the world. Other theologians are interested in the fact that this is the confirmation that Jesus was indeed the Son of God, at least according to their definition of Son of God, and that Jesus was really doing the divine will when he was performing miracles, raising the dead, and that sort of thing in his ministry. For other people, the resurrection represents the first fruits of the general resurrection, when we shall all be raised from the dead. And I love the way that one theologian, Jürgen Moltmann, puts it. He talks about something, I'll give you the fancy terminology and you can promptly forget it, proleptic eschatology. In other words, The general resurrection will occur at some indeterminate point in the far future, and we're living now in the present. And, of course, the resurrection itself took place 2,000 years ago. And what happens is that, like a sheet of paper, it is bent inward, so that the end time, the time of the general resurrection, is bent inward across time to that empty tomb, so that in Jesus you are actually catching a glimpse of what we shall all experience when we're raised from the dead. Now, all of these things have biblical backing, and I think that there's some merit to all of these theologies and many more that have come along over the years. But I just want to tell you what I personally feel about the resurrection. So this is one man's point of view, and you can take it as such. As I've often said to you, I like to go by the facts, because when I'm called upon to just take a leap of faith because somebody in authority tells me to believe something, or they tell me that there's a book that is authoritative and I've got to go by it, I just rebel. Maybe it's because I was a teenager in the 60s. Maybe it's because I was born on St. Thomas's Day. But whatever the reason, if it isn't factual, I cannot believe it. Also, I find that in sharing the gospel with non-Christians, this is what they're always asking, is how can you prove what you believe? It's a fantastic belief. It sounds more like fiction than it does reality. And so it's incumbent upon the evangelist, the person who's sharing the good news, to explain why a non-Christian should believe it. So often evangelists go out there, people that go door to door, for instance, and when you ask, why should I believe this, they open up the book and they say, because it's written in the book. Well, why should I believe the book or your interpretation of the book? So we need, I think, to have a basis in the real world. We need to be able to hold on to certain facts. John believed that. 1 John chapter 1, verse 1, you see that he lays a great emphasis on the fact that what we believe is something that's tangible, something that we can grasp a hold of in the real world. It's not just a blind leap into the unknown. So here's the way that I understand the resurrection of Jesus. There is no tangible evidence for the resurrection, or indeed for the life of Jesus himself. Now, that's not a crazy statement. We could say the same of just about anybody that lived in the first century. And Jesus was a poor man. He was simply a simple rabbi that walked around Israel and shared his good news. So, rightfully, we shouldn't expect that there's going to be any tangible evidence of his life. But we do have something tangible that we can point to when we speak about the resurrection. Even though we're not sure of exactly which is the tomb in which his body was laid, even the basics of the story we cannot prove, we can say that something extraordinary happened back then in 33 AD that changed the group of people that followed him, made up of tax collectors and fishermen, ordinary folk from every walk of life, men and women, all of them who, after the crucifixion, were running for their lives or hiding out in the upper room or simply weeping unconsolably over the loss of their master. Suddenly something happened that made them have a whole different outlook. They turned from being scared, confused, and grieving people to a people with a very clear mission. one that took them out into the world to spread the gospel. The stories of each of the apostles and other followers of Jesus, other disciples, are quite extraordinary. And it's hard to reconcile that with people going out telling a fiction that they know is a fiction. These people had some kind of an experience that changed them forever. And as I've said in a previous study on this, you can't explain it as a mass hallucination. It is too detailed, too certain. The people involved, people like, for instance, the Apostle Paul, are too intellectual, and they've got too vested an interest in not being Christians to explain the fact that they have had this massive turnaround in their life because of a hallucination, or because they've been fooled in some way to believe that Jesus was raised from the grave. I mean, Paul was so convinced that he was not raised from the grave that he was actually hunting Christians and getting quite a popular reputation doing so. So, no, I don't think that these people were fooled. They experienced something that was so hard to describe that when they try to give the details of their experience, it kind of comes out in a confused way and sometimes even conflicts with the testimony of others. And yet they're all saying the same thing when it comes down to it. They're saying, look, that tomb was empty, the stone was rolled away. The close disciples of Jesus saw him first, and then about 500 witnesses. And our lives were turned upside down, inside out. We were motivated to leave our homes, to leave our families, leave our work, and go out into the unknown to share this good news because Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, told us to do so. We know that most of the disciples, most of the apostles, suffered terrible deaths. They were persecuted and imprisoned and executed. They were mocked. They were chased from town to town and treated as pariahs amongst the people that had formerly been their community, their families. Something so convinced them, all of them, to go out into the world and share this story. And at no point do they contradict each other on the essential message that Jesus was raised from the grave. There's no indication that at some point one of them said, well, we all got together and we decided to create this lie, this conspiracy, in order that we could make some money or get a reputation. No, nobody ever does say that it was a conspiracy amongst those that claim to be first-hand witnesses. And they, as I said, they gave up so much. And yet they never turned back and said, I'm going home. I'm giving up. This isn't worth it. I don't think I really had this experience after all. The church, as we know it today, billions of people spread across this planet, is the direct result of the change in the lives of those first witnesses. So then, I think the primary evidence for the resurrection is an indirect evidence, but it's very convincing, and that is the change in the lives of the people who were the witnesses to the resurrection. And the invitation that they gave to others when they went out preaching the gospel was, if you doubt us, if you have concerns about our message and you find it hard to believe, just take the same step yourself. Believe even though you haven't seen, just on the authority of our first-hand experience. And we promise you that you will have an experience very similar to ours. You will know the living Christ in your life. You will see a change come about in your life that could never have been accomplished by sheer positive thinking. This is something that we can all experience if only we're willing to open our hearts and our minds to it. So that was at its simplest, without getting into a lot of conflicting theologies and proof texting. At its simplest, that is what the resurrection is all about. Changed lives. And then those people whose lives were changed, inviting us to experience the same thing as them. We can argue all we like about whether it makes sense that the tomb being empty represented a resurrection. We can argue about what that resurrection was all about, how you would understand it according to physical laws and modern scientific methods. And that's interesting, and I love to participate in debates and conversations like that. I love to read books where people speculate. But in the end, as I said, I'm going to repeat it one last time. It's all about an experience, an inexplicable, inexpressible experience that occurred in the lives of these first-hand witnesses to the resurrection, whatever that is, in the 1st century A.D., and how those changed men and women went out into the world. They almost staggered out into the world, like, wow, you won't believe what we have seen, what we have heard. Come and experience it yourself. Come and see. It's quite amazing, this new life that we have started to live, and we invite you to do the same. That, to me, in the end, is what Easter is about. Now, as I said at the beginning, it falls at the same time of year as our spring festival, when we have Easter bunnies and Easter eggs, and we have arts and crafts and flowers and Easter lilies and all manner of traditions to celebrate the coming of new life after the winter. And that's fine. But separate that out from the message that you hear in church on Easter Sunday morning. The message that the tomb was empty, that the first followers of Jesus had an experience that was mind-bending and life-altering, and that the ripples of that experience are still moving down through the centuries to our time and changing lives today. Well, I hope you found these studies helpful. We're coming up very soon now to Ascension Day, and I'll talk a little bit next week about the Ascension of Jesus, and then we come into Whitsuntide, or Pentecost season, and I'm thinking that perhaps we might look at the Holy Spirit and what we understand the Holy Spirit to be and how the Spirit of God changes our lives. So tune in for that as well. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy this beautiful weather. See you next week.